He was defiant, but now Boris Johnson looks caught in a tight corner. The UK leader was told he can't force Brexit without a deal. He's got the parliament suspended, but his bid for a snap election is rejected. So, what are his options now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Only a few days ago, he said he would rather die in a ditch than ask the EU for an extension to Brexit negotiations. But it seems that Boris Johnson may have to admit defeat and find another way to deal with his deeply divided government. His attempt to call an early election has been thrown out and Parliament suspended for the next 5 weeks. He needed more than 430 votes to get a snap election. He only got 293. That's left him in a tight corner if he wants the UK to leave the bloc on October 31st. So where does this leave Brexit? Could there be a second referendum? And what will opposition parties do next? We have lots to get into with our guests, but first, Lawrence Lee reports on a dramatic night in British politics.
Mr. Speaker, the Lords, who are authorised by Her Majesty's Commission to declare her royal assent to acts passed by both Houses and to also declare the prorogation of Parliament, desire the presence of this honourable House.
Really? No.
Quite what the outside world makes of the British Parliament shutting down for 5 weeks when the UK is going through the biggest political crisis since World War II is anyone's guess. It was certainly less than popular among opposition MPs and the Speaker of the House of Commons.
This is not, however, a normal prorogation. It is not typical. It is not standard. It's one of the longest for decades, and it represents, not just in the minds of many colleagues, but huge numbers of people outside, an act of executive fiat.
As Conservatives filed out, they were heckled by opposition MPs who refused to leave. They tried to stop the Speaker from leaving and then sang protest songs in the chamber.
Keep the red flag flying here.
It served to demonstrate only too clearly the collapse of traditional politics here.
Government ministers have offered no explanation of the deal they are seeking, even if there is such a deal they're seeking, let alone any worked-out proposals presented to Parliament for scrutiny. No wonder they're so keen to prorogue so early to avoid any scrutiny of what they're doing.
The ayes to the right, 293. The noes to the left, 46.
Earlier, Boris Johnson had lost his 6th vote in 6 days. Even fewer MPs casting their ballots for an October election than had done when he tried it the first time. And so, while the opposition accused him of cowardice for suspending Parliament, he accused them of the same thing.
The right honourable gentleman's cronies, together with those of other opposition parties, have been trying to disguise their preposterous cowardice by coming up with ever more outrageous excuses for delaying an election until the end of October or perhaps November, or when hell freezes over. In the dither, delay and procrastination that has become the hallmark of the opposition.
Before Parliament was put into this induced coma, the opposition was able to force Boris Johnson into a corner. He is now going to have to seek some sort of compromise with the European Union if the UK is to leave the bloc by the end of October, as he insists must happen. But that in turn will infuriate the most pro-Brexit right wing of the party and will inevitably cost them seats whenever the national election happens. With his cabinet holding its regular meeting, these calculations will all be in play. Rumours abound of the potential for more resignations from the ruling party, as Johnson's many critics say his grip over Brexit becomes ever weaker. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, London.
All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining me from London, Bobby Friedman, political commentator on UK politics and the author of Bercow, Mr. Speaker, Rowdy Living in the Tory Party. From Birmingham on Skype, Alex de Ruyter, director of the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University. And also from London, Sonia Purnell, journalist and author of Just Boris, A Tale of Blond Ambition. Welcome you all to the program. Sonia, let me start with you. Boris Johnson has lost 6 important votes in 6 days. Just how damaged is he right now?
Well, listen, I don't think any other Prime Minister has ever gone through what he has. I mean, he does look quite often like a man defeated, a man who's had the rug pulled out from under his feet. I mean, interestingly, actually, last night, he performed slightly better in the Commons than he has done to date. But I think he does look like a man who knows he's in a corner. Now we just have to guess, or possibly try and guess, how on earth he gets out of this corner. Will he resign, as some people say he might? Will he call a second referendum on Brexit, as other people say that he might? It's a perfect storm. So many avenues are now closed. He's going to have to do something really radical to get out of this mess. Otherwise, he is going to be a very short-lived Prime Minister indeed.
Bobby, Boris Johnson tried to outsmart Parliament. It seems now that he's the one who's been outmaneuvered by Parliament, wouldn't you say?
Well, certainly things have not gone quite as Boris would have planned so far, but there's an awfully long way to go in this. Boris has got 2 escape routes, really. The first is to go and get a deal from the EU. I still think that that is possible. And what he has successfully done, I think, is change the mood music in Parliament so that if he does bring some kind of deal back to the House of Commons, he's much more likely to get it voted through, something that Theresa May, his predecessor as Prime Minister, was unable to do. The House of Commons has passed legislation requiring Boris, not until October the 19th, though, but requiring him to send a letter to the EU asking for an extension to the Brexit date, something he said he'd rather die in a ditch than do. But I do think that he's got 5 weeks now when Parliament isn't sitting, 5 weeks in which he can twist an awful lot of arms and try and manoeuvre himself into a better position. So, I mean, you're certainly right. Not been an easy few days for Boris Johnson, but I still think he does live to fight another day, at least for now.
Alex, from your perspective, did Boris Johnson really believe that suspending Parliament would or could be a winning strategy, considering how divided politics are right now in Britain?
I think in a sense it's difficult to say, and I don't claim to understand exactly what Boris thinks in that regard, but looking at the nature of his appointments, Dominic Cummings, perhaps they expected a 3-line whip to be religiously adopted by all Conservative MPs, you know, for Parliament to, or at least the Conservatives in Parliament to effect quite a degree of self-abasement in that regard, and clearly for the 21 or 22 rebels, including Amber Rudd, that was just too much, and they decided in their view to put country before party. So, no, I don't think Boris quite anticipated that degree of an outbreak of conscientiousness on their part, as they would see it.
Bobby, you mentioned before that Boris Johnson had stated publicly that he would rather be dead in a ditch than to ask for another extension on Brexit from the EU. But, of course, there is this new law that compels him now to ask for an extension. If he does not do that, what happens?
Well, he's got 2 choices, really. He can either resign or he will have to ask for that extension. If he were to refuse to, in the face of the law, what would happen is that someone would go to court, get a court order requiring him to send that letter. Some people are saying that Boris Johnson would go to prison. I think, frankly, that's a bit fanciful, probably wishful thinking on the part of some people who'd like to see him go to prison. That's because what would happen would be the court could itself sign the letter or nominate someone apart from Boris to sign the letter. And there's another stage that would have to be gone through before Boris could even be threatened with being sent to prison. So that isn't a likely outcome. But the one thing you also have to factor in is that the curiosity of this law is that Boris doesn't have to send that request. Now he can wait until October the 19th. And so he can, within that period of time, try and make it deeply unattractive for the EU to grant that extension, or perhaps to grant it for quite so long, because he could say to the EU, for example, that Britain won't nominate a commissioner, that it will veto the various laws that the other EU countries want to put forward. And then the EU's then left in a position where it's thinking, do we want to allow Britain to remain in the EU? And there are some countries, particularly France, which are rather nervous about giving Britain a long extension. Others, such as Germany, more in favour of giving that extension. So that is the crucial period of time for Boris Johnson over the next 5 weeks. But you are right that if he gets to October the 19th and he hasn't got a deal that he could put through Parliament, and the EU has indicated that it will offer that extension, either he does have to resign, or ultimately he or someone nominated by the court will end up having to send that letter.
Sonia, what do you think about this point? I mean, I heard you mention earlier that there are people asking questions about would Boris Johnson potentially go to prison if he does not ask for this extension. You just heard now Bobby talk about the fact that there is speculation on this point as well. Is there a scenario that exists currently by which Boris Johnson could perhaps go to court, could perhaps face prison time if he actually breaks the law as Prime Minister?
Well, listen, we are in totally uncharted waters. I mean, Britain has never had politics as tumultuous as this for hundreds of years. I think it's really difficult, impossible even, to say how things are going to pan out. Technically, yes, he could go to prison if he refused to obey a court order. He would then be in contempt of court, which is a crime in this country that can carry a prison sentence. So it is all possible. That said, I think it is actually unlikely. However, he is such a long way from finding a deal that the issues that faced Theresa May, his predecessor, face him still now. The only deal that has been agreed by all sides is the withdrawal agreement. The problem is that the British Parliament doesn't like it, but the EU won't change it. So we just go round and round and round and round in circles, and something has got to break this. Now, I mean, if Boris Johnson can, I don't believe he can really come up with a different deal, but maybe he can find a different way out of this. I mean, there are many people who signed up to support him when he was going for the leadership of the Conservative Party, believing that he might potentially call a second referendum. Now, I know that looks unlikely at the moment, but we had Oliver Letwin, a very senior Tory, now a Tory rebel, only this morning saying that he now backed one and that many others do too. Could this potentially be a way out? It would be an extraordinary one, but it's a possible one.
Alex, I saw you nodding, so it looked like you wanted to jump in. I'm going to let you have the opportunity now, but I also wanted to ask you if you could expand on the point that was made there by Sonia. I mean, a lot of people watching what's going on in Britain around the world are wondering why a second referendum is not possible. Do you think it is possible?
Yeah, I do think a second referendum is possible. Certainly, I think that if it was an alternative government, you know, say, for argument's sake, that an election resulted in a Labor-led government, Labor's, you know, come out and said that they would back a referendum and that they would put Remain on the ballot box as an option versus a withdrawal agreement, for example. I certainly think that's a possibility. I personally think it's the only way to break this Brexit impasse. In terms of what prospects are there still for a withdrawal agreement to be approved, you know, we've had the suggestion emerge that perhaps Boris might try and revert to the EU's original proposal to only keep Northern Ireland under the provisions of the so-called backstop arrangements after the expiry of a transition period, that at least would allow him to escape the orbit of an EU customs union and pursue a so-called independent trade policy. The problem, again, for him, of course, is going to be that if he were to try and approach that direction of travel, that the DUP would oppose it. The Labour Party, of course, you know, their preference has been to keep a customs union with the EU intact and close along with a single market. And then, of course, you've got the so-called European Research Group, the Tory MPs who I think would be unlikely to support it as well. So it's deeply problematic to see how he could get a withdrawal agreement through. And therefore, you know, you're then looking at these scenarios of a general election to try and break the parliamentary deadlock. I'm not sure it necessarily would, to be honest. I mean, that the polls put the Tories on about a third of the public's voting intentions. Is that enough to secure a majority, even if they behaved in tandem with the Brexit Party? I'm not so sure. So I certainly would endorse the logic of a referendum, another referendum as perhaps being the only way to break this.
Bob, you just heard Alex talk about backstop. Now this plan, this has been one of the main, if not the main, sticking point when it comes to accomplishing Brexit. Now, on Monday, we saw Boris Johnson with his Irish counterpart, Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, in Dublin, and they both acknowledged that no new ground had been found. How does this problem get resolved? Can it get resolved?
Well, there are only two ways. One is if new technology is come up with, and that's what Angela Merkel was talking about with Boris Johnson last month. There hasn't, it seems, been any concrete progress on that, but that's one way of doing it. The other, as Alex says, and I think this is a more likely outcome, is that instead of having a UK-wide backstop, you just have Northern Ireland having a backstop. And that's obviously more acceptable in many ways because Northern Ireland is part of the island of Ireland with the Republic. There's also politically, there's just a sense that the rest of the UK, Great Britain, often doesn't so much mind if Northern Ireland does something a little bit different. So as long as the rest of the UK had left the customs union, that probably would be politically acceptable. Alex was mentioning before the issue of the DUP, the Northern Irish Party, which is in a supply and confidence arrangement propping up the Conservative government at the moment. But interestingly, on television a couple of nights ago, one of the senior members of the DUP said that they would consider that. And when you go back to first principles on that, there's no reason really why it wouldn't be acceptable to have just Northern Ireland in the customs union. There are all sorts of ways in which Northern Ireland is treated differently to the rest of the UK. For example, when it comes to utilities, things like electricity, there is a single market for that just for the island of Ireland. It makes sense because it is an island. So I think that might be one way where people are moving towards some kind of compromise. And you have to remember, this is where things are very different from when Theresa May brought her deal back before Parliament, because her deal, and I think a lot of people, particularly on the Labour side, moderate Labour MPs who didn't vote for it, potentially now regret that. And we even saw the other night a group of them asking to have another vote on Theresa May's deal. So that's why I think if there is some kind of compromise with that kind of backstop, yes, it is right that Boris would not win all of the votes of the right wing of his party, but a number of them are part of his government now. They're bound by collective cabinet responsibility and would probably vote for it. And you then have a whole series of Labour MPs who have been worn down by everything that's happened since Theresa May's deal failed, the lack of progress. You have the country. People are sick of Brexit. They want some kind of resolution. And so I think MPs are now much more willing to go for a deal. So I do think that if Boris can come up with something, it doesn't have to be everything. He doesn't have to shoot for the moon. It just has to be a deal with a few tweaks compared to what we had before. And I do think that could offer him a way out.
Sonia, do you think there's a chance we could see Boris Johnson in the weeks ahead go to the EU with a modified version of Theresa May's Brexit deal?
There is obviously a chance, but I was in Northern Ireland at the weekend and talking to people there. I think there could well be a problem with this idea of a sort of separate treatment of Northern Ireland. There may be terms in the Good Friday Agreement, which was the peace agreement that brokered this spectacularly successful peace in Northern Ireland, at least until now. There may be problems with that agreement. It may go counter to that. Also, Boris Johnson will have in his mind that if he does go for that kind of amended deal, what does that mean for Scotland? You can imagine that the Scots immediately are going to say, well, you know, if Northern Ireland are going to be able to stay in the customs union, then why on earth can't we in Scotland? And that will push the independence of Scotland, you know, that issue up the agenda hugely. So then you start having this whole idea, you know, will the United Kingdom actually manage to survive the whole process of Brexit? And I think, you know, Boris Johnson himself has appointed himself Minister for the Union, Minister for the United Kingdom. Well, that would see that cause hugely damaged. So again, none of these so-called solutions are really easy or straightforward, and I still fail to see that will definitely work. So I think we just come back again and again and again. Do we go back to Theresa May's deal? Do we perhaps attach to it the sort of idea that people will pass it as long as the population can have another vote in it, an informed consent, if you like? This has now become a more fashionable idea. So we'll see.
Alex, if Boris Johnson does go ahead and seek an extension from the EU, how likely is it that that request would be granted?
Well, I mean, notwithstanding the caveats that Bobby put up earlier, I do think it is highly likely. I mean, clearly the economic consequences of no deal would be negative for both sides, obviously far more so the UK, but, you know, would hit companies in Germany and France, for example, as well. So I don't think it's in anyone's desire to want to see a no-deal outcome. you know, the question may well be in terms of what length of extension would be offered. I've seen reports to suggest that the French, for example, were toying with an extension of 2 years being proposed so that the Brits could, quote, sort out Brexit. How that would fly, I don't know. But certainly I think the likelihood of an extension being granted, the line from the EU was always that any further extension would be conditional upon some critical juncture, you know, be it, for example, a general election or another referendum, as it were. You know, I don't think we could just see this never-ending series of extensions going on and on and on. And bear in mind, in the background of all this, the current withdrawal agreement on the table, you know, it's not been renegotiated as it stands. The transition period in that withdrawal agreement was only scheduled to last till the end of next year. And of course, if the parties on both sides wanted to then extend that transition arrangement, they would have to give a 6-month lead-in period. So all the while, we're you know, bracket creeping into the length of this withdrawal agreement in terms of the status quo still applying of EU membership conditions.
Alex, so it certainly looks like, I just want to follow up with you, it does look like elections are looming, but not the time frame that Boris Johnson wants, right?
No, I mean, it looks like, you know, especially now that he's prorogued the Parliament and it won't reconvene until the 14th of October, I think simply the time frame there required for him to have an October election, given that he hasn't got a majority in Parliament to get one through. The Fixed-Term Parliament Act, of course, requires him to secure the assent of 2/3 of MPs in order to have one within a parliamentary term. Now with proroguing Parliament for 5 weeks, but then talking MPs returning on the 14th of October, you know, if MPs were to agree, hypothetically, to an election at that point, you know, the minimum period really you're looking at here is about 6 weeks. So that would take us towards the end of November.
Bobby, I know that we're dealing with a lot of speculation here, but from your point of view, who has the most to gain and who has the most to lose from an election?
Well, I think both sides have huge amounts to gain and huge amounts to lose. I mean, I think there's a genuine prospect of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister after an election. That's because the Conservatives do have a clear policy on Brexit, but they face a challenge from Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, which could potentially split the vote. And the Conservatives will do badly in a lot of marginals in the southwest. They'll do badly in Scotland. They will lose seats there. They will expect to win some seats back from Labour in the Midlands and potentially in the north. But it comes to it, I think Jeremy Corbyn has a real shot, and particularly after the election, if the Conservatives don't have an all-out majority, then I think the other parties will prop up Jeremy Corbyn. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, I mean, this is really the last roll of the dice for him when it comes to an election, because ultimately he is asking for one because he can't get anything through Parliament at the moment. He feels that the stasis can't go on. And he, as I say, does need to win an outright majority to stay in power, in my view.
Bobby,
and that means doing better than Theresa May did last time round.
Bobby, I'm sorry to interject. It's just that we only have about a minute left. I want to ask Sonia one last question. Sonia, Brexit has obviously really fractured British politics. Things are so divided right now. How does the country come back from this?
Oh, I think this is really going to be very difficult. And I fear that all the ideas for Brexit at the moment are just going to make it worse, even more long-lived. If there is a no deal, that's just the beginning of it. We have years, if not decades, of more negotiations. Even if we go through with the Theresa May deal, that's only the beginning of that too. Again, we have years and years and years of negotiations. I mean, I think, honestly, if there was a way of remaining and reforming, then actually, funny enough, that would probably be the most healing option. But it's a big sell to do now. I mean, Boris Johnson, probably being that great salesman, could do that job if he so wanted. I just wonder if there's a very, very slight chance that he might go for it.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Bobby Friedman, Alex de Ruyter, and Sonia Purnell. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.